Kia ora everyone, and thank you to Waikato University for hosting this forum and for giving me the opportunity to speak. So as Anna mentioned, I'm Donna Purdue, I'm the Chief Economist at MB. And for those of you that don't know me, I've spent most of my career as a bank economist, and in 2015 I decided to make the transition to the public sector, in the thinking that I would go from predominantly forecasting the implications of policy to actually having the opportunity to be able to influence the direction of policy. So 6 years on, I'm thinking that that was a little bit of a naive kind of idea. But I mentioned that because I think the conversations yesterday really did highlight to me the frustration that I know many people have with the public sector, and certainly the policy approaches that the public sector uses. And the session at the end of yesterday, Cameron Bagri and Eric and Paul, making some comments around the fact that public sector isn't incentivized to take risk, that we don't experiment, and that we haven't invested necessarily in the knowledge of the public sector. And I do agree with that. But I think, obviously in part that's a reflection of the systems and the institutional settings and structures that we have in place. But also I think it's a reflection of the fact that we do hold this view that the private sector is the only sector that can create value, and that the public sector's only role is to correct market failures, to de-risk and to level the playing field. And I think, if any of you are familiar with Mariana Mazzucato's work, who's influenced quite a lot of the work, and I'll be talking about some of the approaches that she's been looking at through my conversation today, but you'll know that there is a significant literature that's now debunking that myth, and yet we still largely have this view that a smaller government is better. And I think that in times of massive transformation, which we have been talking about, and times of disruption, we certainly need to challenge that view. I'm not saying we necessarily need a bigger government, but we definitely need to invest in a smarter, more effective government. So having said that, in the 10 minutes or so that I've got, let me talk to you today about the topic of business innovation in a post-COVID world. And I wanted to focus on a new potential policy approach that's getting some traction internationally, that of mission-led policy. But first, let me just give you a little bit of context around the case for change. And I know we've talked a little bit about this already over the last day or so. But when I'm, looking at the COVID situation, businesses clearly have adapted, I think, quite well to COVID-19. Some of our research that we did through our Better for Business team in conjunction with Research New Zealand showed that businesses took a variety of strategies. They looked at retrenchment strategies, so managing labour costs through reducing hours and delaying pay increases, that sort of thing. But also some investment strategies where they were taking the opportunity to invest in digital technology to allow more remote working or online sales or contactless business. But when we look at some of the big challenges that businesses are facing into, and I'm talking about not just climate change, I'm talking about aging and demographic change, resource scarcity, environmental degradation, urbanisation, technology change, and you look at the big transformational shifts that are coming out of that. So things around the circular economy, and I know Les and Tom are going to talk about that shortly, but also around wellbeing economy, experience economy, biogrowth economy, and so on. There's definitely a sense that it's more than just adaptation that we need by businesses, households, and government. We need quite significant change. And on top of that, government has set some pretty bold targets, not just around carbon, but also things like our child poverty targets, swimmable rivers, predator-free, having all New Zealanders able to live in a dry, safe, warm home. So as I said, all of these things coming together, my sense is that adaptation's not enough, and that we do actually need to transform quite significantly everything that we do. So I guess the question for me as the chief economist of MB, our policy shop, is how do we do those things? How do we do things differently? How do we use policy to catalyse innovation in order that we're able to basically make the most of the opportunities of these big trends, or at least mitigate the risks that we're facing into? So doing things differently, I really think from my perspective that rethinking the role of government is critical. So when I was sitting in MB in 2017, when the new coalition government came in and they shifted the economic strategy from just being focused on productivity to actually focusing on productive, sustainable, inclusive growth, I think that fundamentally changed the way policy, or we needed to think about policy, particularly from an economic development perspective. So we were no longer focused just on a rate of growth or the productivity. We were now having to focus on a direction of growth, so sustainability and inclusion. And I think it became quite obvious. I mean, it was really tricky for us to get our heads around what that actually means. And the sense is that we couldn't rely on traditional policy approaches that just fixed markets, that we were looking for policy approaches that allowed us to shape and co-create markets so that we were making sure we were able to achieve that direction of growth. And so these shaping policies, or co-creating type policies, have got the name now of mission-led or mission-oriented. So what do I mean by mission-led? So the OECD in January this year actually released a paper. So it's reviewing around 40-odd international policy approaches in this mission-led area, and they basically did the review to be able to help us understand the best ways to, if we're going to go down this policy approach, the best ways to design and implement these more systemic sort of policy approaches. And they described they defined the mission-led innovation as a coordinated package of policy and regulatory measures tailored specifically to mobilise science, technology and innovation in order to address well-defined objectives and related to a societal challenge in a defined timeframe. So essentially, they are purpose-led or outcomes-focused policies. And a key goal really is to catalyse and crowd in private sector investment in order for us to be able to drive that sort of transformative innovation that we're looking for. So what does it mean in practice? So as I mentioned, a large part of it is taking the view that government is no longer just around fixing markets, not saying that the market failure approach is wrong or shouldn't be used, but that it's no longer just in that space, that we are actively shaping and creating. So it also encompasses a shift in focus from marginal improvements driven for value for money to public creation driven by public purpose. It also uses different analytical frameworks for policy evaluation. So the traditional cost-benefit analysis framework is replaced in favour of more dynamic evaluation tools that allow us to capture spillover effects and structural changes. It requires new public sector capabilities. And I heard Vicky talking before about public sector thinking outside the square or outside the box. That's definitely in this space, but it also requires a lot of capability around coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. There are governance structures required that will enable a cross-sector and cross-institutional or cross-agency collaboration. They've also involved different and new funding and financial instruments. So some of the work that has been done, particularly in small advanced economies and in Europe, they've been looking to green investment banks, for example, I think in Scotland, they've established one, they've been talking, or there's recommendations for one, I think in Norway. But it's not just, establishing new banks, it's using things like challenge prizes. And particularly of interest to me because of my role at MB and we have government procurement, there are lots of options around using government procurement in order to drive the innovation that's required. But I think one of the really key aspects of this type of approach is that it puts citizen participation at the heart of the policy. So for New Zealand, with the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Ao Māori perspectives, and the way we need to, bring a much more collaborative, joined up sort of approach, I think mission-led policies lend themselves well to those ideas. So as I said, Mariana Mazzucato has been influencing a lot of the work that I've been doing in recent years. And she's one of the leading economists in this space, I would argue, and she's established through the University College of London, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where they're doing a lot of this work. And they've established this framework that you can see here, the conceptual framework of how these missions work. So essentially they establish a grand challenge, and from that the mission is really breaking that grand challenge down into concrete targets that allow us to frame and stimulate innovation. So they're essentially what connects the grand challenge and the specific projects. They set a direction for a solution when they're established, but they don't go in with an answer. So the idea, that the right answers are not known in advance. And the idea is that we get a portfolio of research and innovation projects across sectors to develop a different range of solutions to achieve what the mission is, and to reward those actors that are willing to take risks and experiment. And ultimately, it means that we're not, so a lot of the industry policy that we've looked at in the past, certainly through the 70s, 80s and 90s, was very much around taking a sector view, so a vertical view. These ones of this policy, it's very systemic, and it's mostly focused on, looking at problems that we really want to solve, as opposed to focusing on particular sectors and looking at the capabilities required to achieve that. So there's about 5 criteria or characteristics for selecting missions. So they must be bold and inspirational with wide societal relevance. They provide a clear direction, and they're targeted and measurable and time-bound. They're ambitious and lead to research and innovation actions. They're cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, and allow for that multidisciplinary approach. Importantly, they lead to multiple bottom-up solutions. So I just wanted to give you an example of one of the mission-led frameworks that was established by Mariana and her team at IIPP. So they worked with the UK government in 2017 on an industrial strategy white paper, and as part of that they established a series of green challenges, and one of them was around the future of mobility. So the commission worked, Mariana's team worked with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to develop up what the sort of roadmap would look like. And you can see here the actual specific mission was by 2040 to put the UK at the forefront of safe, sustainable, universally acceptable travel, creating congestion and emission-free zero accident systems. And you can see the range of sectors that would need to be involved in order to achieve this, and a number of possible projects that could be worked on in order to achieve the goal. So I don't want to give the impression that these approaches are easy. Certainly, some of the literature that's coming out at the moment in terms of assessing this new policy approach, and certainly the paper earlier this year by the OECD shows that it's definitely not all plain sailing. So some of the issues that have cropped up are that the policy initiatives have really struggled to set missions with the required, those 5 characteristics or criteria. That the missions themselves take a really long time to set, as it requires a gradual and inclusive process. So that initial establishing the mission and working through that takes quite a lot of time. The governance structures are really complex with multiple layers. And at the moment, there are very few evaluations of some of these projects that have been put in place. And most of the evaluations that have been done still rely on traditional evaluation tools and methods, so CBA. And I guess the other thing is that a lot of these new approaches have involved quite a bit of additional cost, and that's mainly been due to some of the complex governance arrangements that are required. And the OECD paper goes into that a bit more. So I think I've probably gone well over time, but I wanted to just quickly summarize. So, businesses have shown surprising resilience and ability to adapt, but I think, there's a lot of disruption ahead, and there will be a lot more need for business innovation to allow us to address some of these big challenges. I think the mission-led policy approaches are gaining traction internationally, and they do provide potential for us to catalyse the innovation that we need. And New Zealand definitely has the opportunity to trial this approach. And I have been working alongside MFE with Mariana Mazzucato and her team on what a mission for New Zealand could look like. But as with anything new, it definitely comes with risk. And from that perspective, it's absolutely important that we learn from the growing international evidence on the best way to implement and design these policies if we do decide to go down that path. So I will stop there and hand it back.
Thanks very much, Donna. Well, we've got Les and Tom. Are you going to make your way to the stage at the moment, or do you want... Great. And if we can ask Les and Tom if you could... yeah, you could come and have one of these seats. Yeah. If we could ask you to keep it reasonably concise so we've got a bit of time for questions.
Yeah, sure will. Okay, well, I'm going to start the presentation, and Tom's going to add significant value to what I'm going to say. So I have to give a little bit of genesis to what I'm going to talk about to put it into context. 2018, 2019, a couple of scientists in the university here were wanting to find out how their great ideas could change elements of aiming towards zero waste in New Zealand. So they got all these great ideas coming out of the materials groups in the university, and how could they get them into business? We'd also got the Sustainable Business Network, who were trying to introduce issues and ideas related to circularity. And they were asking various people, including me, what's this circularity stuff about? When I told this person about zero waste, and that zero waste was neither necessary nor sufficient for increasing well-being in a sustainable way, she was, what I think the common parlance is, gobsmacked. She thought that this is all, this was a great idea. When I told the Sustainable Business Network that there wasn't a circular economy, but there are many, many versions of a circular economy, they were sort of slightly annoyed too. So what I'm going to talk about today is how that turned into a project that was eventually funded by MB. And I'm going to throw out a number of words that I hope people will take offense about. One of them is well-being, one of them is circularity. But I'm hoping that you can see how we're going to do it differently. And a key point that's going to come through, I hope, is that we're going to be looking at issues of sustainable development, well-being, and circularity within a fundamentally New Zealand environment. One where we're going to be and are co-creating these issues and these ideas as we go along. So we've got to talk a little bit about COVID. So COVID certainly exposed New Zealand to supply chain issues, and this is going to be an element that will potentially be important in operationalizing any version of a circular economy. Similarly, we found that New Zealand wasn't able to access all the raw materials it normally had access to because of closing the borders. And that meant that certain industries, certain products were left in limbo, couldn't be produced because they weren't available domestically. We know about tourists. I'm not going to talk any more about that. We know about the effectiveness of closing the borders in relation to the pandemic, but we know the problems of closing the borders too. We've already have people alluding to issues that health became the only priority, and many other priorities were seen to be dependent on dealing with COVID, although that was never really quantified at the time. And as John Gibson talked about yesterday, when we start to quantify some of these things, when you have a health-only goal, you miss a lot of things along the way. Now, this government's been talking about transformation, and Donna was talking about transformation too. But there's no real evidence that the government has any plan at all for what sort of transformation that we're talking about. It seems, I think, the interest in this workshop, this forum, is that many of you, probably all of you, are in the same position, that you don't know what the government's planning to do post-COVID either. We don't really have a plan. Well-being is probably going to come back onto the agenda, but well-being, taking a point from Arthur Grimes, who couldn't be here, well-being has been a function of government behaviour since the 1890s. Well-being and well-being budgets are not new. It's just that the term well-being is being used in a different context. When I was talking to the scientists, they didn't quite understand that there are many different versions of sustainability. And I've done some work with a few people looking at sustainable development in New Zealand, getting some numbers, taking the 4 pillars, taking measures of natural, physical, and human capital. And not surprisingly, what have we been doing since the 1950s has not been sustainable in a development sense for New Zealand. We've not been saving enough. Now, that's not rocket science to many of us, but when you look at the numbers, you can see that we've not been acting in a sustainable way. So here is a very brief overview of what we're trying to do under this title of A Mia Mio Aotearoa, a circular economy for New Zealand. And the thing that's really important in terms of the structure is that none of the scientists and none of the business people that we talked about really understood what the goal of this sort of transformation, this view of the economy was about. They talked about circularity as the means and the end in its own right. When I told them that what we should be looking for, when I talked to them about this, ultimately we're looking for things that increase well-being, and we increase well-being over time. Now, well-being, one of those buzzy sort of words. But as I said, well-being budgets have been around for 120 odd years. It's just what we've put into well-being as a measure that's changed over time. What we're doing right at this time, Tom and I and a few extra colleagues of Tom, is that we are not simply taking a measure of well-being that we've picked up from an OECD or a Finland or a Norwegian or a Scottish version of what well-being is about, but we're co-creating that measure. And co-creation is one where we're taking some of the best things from a Western science, a Pākehā version of well-being, but informed by and intertwined with Maori notions of well-being. And we're along the way to generating something that is a specifically New Zealand measure of well-being, but it will look familiar in terms of including issues to do with wealth, issues to do with employment, issues to do with income more broadly. But it will be something that we can measure. And one thing that we were determined to do and are determined to do is to come up with ideas that are measurable. And one of the problems that Treasury has found, particularly with things like the Living Standards Framework, is that when they try and bring in notions which are inherently Maori in terms of their intrinsic values, all that happens is there's an attempt to bolt on some Maori stuff, and then that Maori stuff becomes very hard to monetize. So it doesn't really go anywhere. What we're doing here is we're sort of bringing it up from the bottom up. And Tom is a great advocate for taking the good from a Western idea, and I'm getting better at understanding how to take good stuff from a Maori perspective. And this co-creation is not only sort of great fun, but it's incredibly rewarding. The other thing that seemed to be a problem for businesses and scientists was understanding this idea of sustainable development. They'd heard sustainable and used the word sustainable probably hundreds of times a month, but they all meant different things. And it very, very, very rarely was an intertemporal issue as far as they were concerned. They were just thinking about it. Is it sustainable for this year? Now, what's it going to do to the balance sheet? We are not being that inventive in thinking about our concept of sustainable development. It's a Brundtland notion of sustainable development, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, the word needs is pretty loaded, but what we can do in a New Zealand context is incorporate needs from a Maori perspective, from a Pākehā perspective, make something that is really focused on New Zealand. Then we come to the circular economy. Again, I told them there can be many, many versions of the circular economy. It really depends on the particular structures in New Zealand. It depends upon the prices in New Zealand. It depends on resources in New Zealand. But the basic idea of the circular economy is it's trying to identify an optimal level of loop closing. That's where the circularity part comes from. And in particular, what they're looking for is trying to minimize the models out there, trying to minimize the amount of what they call virgin raw materials. These virgin raw materials are non-renewables as far as they're thinking about them, although they sometimes put in trees, which seems to be really weird. So what you're trying to do is minimize waste. I don't like the word waste, I like the word byproduct. Waste seems to suggest that it doesn't have any value. And extending product life, maintaining materials at their highest value level, optimizing reuse and utilizing energy sources as a strategy to close these material loops. So there's some issues that are common to circular economy notions, but there's different ways of making this work. How are we approaching this? Well, we put together a team which were given responsibilities for three basic elements of the project. One is looking at well-being measures that are tailored for, informed by, agreed by different elements of New Zealand society, in particular Western and Maori notions. And it's not at all hard when we start to think of sustainable development in this space, because Maori and Maori values are intergenerational in their philosophy. The idea that intergenerational transfer, which seemed to be something that was a little bit difficult for some New Zealand businesses to be thinking about, is a fundamental Maori notion. So that's not hard to bring in. We've got a bunch of material scientists, the people that started off these whole questions, who are producing new products, new processes. And those new products and new processes will not only be generated within the university and flipped out there, but the idea is, and the third group has this responsibility, is that what businesses would want would feed back into the university system, into these materials people, and it can be a two-way street. And the third group is a set of management and economists who are actually looking at how these new materials, how these new products, how these new innovations coming both ways, how they get embedded into the real world. And working with businesses in what I regard as a proof of concept idea, where basically these new materials, and I'll come on to this as a closing line, how these new materials can be incorporated into businesses in a way that is going to be profitable for businesses, but still has this notion of circularity built into it, not only reducing waste, but also leading to new innovations where these byproducts, this waste, becomes in itself an input that is creating new products. So it's not just a matter of making a business more efficient and having less waste, but building in this idea that that byproduct can lead to new products itself. And the third group is going to go backwards and forwards, case studies, working with the materials group to find out, what are the areas, what are the materials that are most desirable for New Zealand business. Now, because we've only got a little bit of money and because we've only got 5 years, we're going to focus on two areas that we think are really important. One is in terms of building materials, and the other is in terms of packaging. So on the packaging side, we have issues to do with health and safety. On the materials side, we have difficulties of recycling some of these things because they might not be biodegradable. They may well be in a material that is not easily able to be recycled in a way. Recycling always leads to a reduction in the quality of the recycled product. So when you're recycling plastics, the next level down of plastics from food packaging is going to be of a lower quality and a lower quality and a lower quality as you go through. When you're recycling paper, they often end up as sort of cardboard boxes, end up as egg boxes, and go down the system. So the value as they're recycled tends to decline in the way that they're being reused now. But there's no reason why we can't think of these byproducts having a much higher value use in terms of a more innovative use than simply recycling and recycling all the way through. When it comes to building materials, and at least the Vice-Chancellor's not here anymore, final point coming up now, this love affair with concrete is just absolutely crazy. It's probably one of the most energy-intensive ways of building anything. And we've got lots of trees. And we have lots of technology about the load-bearing strength of laminated wood. And in France, many new public investments have to use, I think, up to at least 20% of their load-bearing structure has to come from renewables, i.e. wood. So this is why we're looking at to what extent can the building sector deal with different types of building methods and still be safe. And in terms of trying to recycle concrete, I don't know if you've ever tried to smash up a bit of concrete and use it for something else, but it's not at all easy to see what else you're going to do apart from maybe stick it at the bottom of a new road. And then again, we've got to be sure that we want that new road. Whereas with renewals, with trees, we can grow more. And the buildings probably look a lot nicer than, dare I say, the law building. dare I say, no, I'm not going to say the next one. Anyway, Anna's given me the wrap-up so far, so I'm going to pass over to Tom. I'm sure there'll be questions. Please don't be polite. Just ask away. Tom. Here you go. They're going to put the new one in a minute.
Well, it's Larry. Tēnā koutou, kia ora hui tātou. My name is Tom Roa. For those of you who have an understanding of Māori, you will know that Roa means long.
We need to.
And I promise you I'm not going to be long.
There you go, Tom.
Here we go. I think this is an old copy, never mind.
Is it? Oh.
A mio mio Aotearoa.
Yes, yeah.
So, in discussing the circular economy, a mio mio is a word that means circular. But it's not that kind of circle which closes in on itself. It's more dynamic. And it can go in all sorts of different ways. And so this circular economy is not just in terms of a circle, but much more dynamic in how we might treat our economy. That's you.
That's me, don't worry. Can we put the other set of slides on I gave you for, it says Tom? Tom, Amio.
Here we are.
That's still, there we go.
There we go. So in terms of a COVID-19 overview, COVID-19, a circumstance beyond our control, to, for, about, within which our responses can be co-created, co-designed, co-decided for the well-being of Aotearoa New Zealand, people and places, through inter- and transdisciplinary approaches, holistic, where a circular economy has well-being at its core and is premised on principles of sustainability. I'm not an economist. I got that from Les. After some very vibrant and very interesting conversations about what is circular economy, what is sustainability, what is well-being. So going back into my mātauranga Māori, I juxtapose Western science, not just in terms of hard sciences, but including economics and other disciplines in this idea of the Western world with my mātauranga Māori. And my mātauranga Māori, just as my academic career, is based and also informed by readings and other informations from within and without of New Zealand. My mātauranga Māori is premised on my karakia, on my whakapapa, on where I come from in this Māori-informed new world. There's a karakia which goes uwe, uwe nuku, uwe, uwe rangi. And in that stanza of that karakia, it talks about how there's so much happening in the world that over which we have absolutely no control. But we live in that world. It's how we respond to that. A toki is an adze. So I have a great toki, he toki nui te toki. I have a long toki, he toki roa te toki. I have a toki which can chop down and then turned around, build up. And so I chop down all of those things that hold rangi in the sky, so that rangi collapses onto Papatuanuku. And then I use that toki to shape something again so that I build rangi back up. And then I chop it down again, but I rebuild. And that's part of this circular dynamic that I get from this karakia. Ka hahau I te takapū o rangi e tui honei, ka hinga, ka mate, kia papatua nuku e takotune. In terms of this Māori ora, hau ora, ora pūmau. Just as Les, and in our conversations with Les, we base this on well-being. And if it's not about well-being of the planet, of the peoples of the planet, then I don't know what we're talking about. For me, it just doesn't make sense that it can't be about well-being. So well-being is this idea of ora. Mauri. Mauri is something that is an essential state of being. Everything that lives has a Mauri. Everything that doesn't live also has a Mauri. If it exists, it has a Mauri. What I'm just saying now has a Mauri. And if it catches you, then it's a Mauri ora. If you go to sleep, good night. So in the circular economy, an interpretation of circular economy is the ora of that Mauri. Hau ora, hau is another kind of spirit. When you are full of hau, you're full of energy and you want to get out there and you want to do all sorts of things. When you got no hau, you're useless. Don't come near me. I don't want anything to do with somebody who hasn't got hau. But perhaps I can do something with that through affecting the Māori ora, so that the person who doesn't have hau, or those things that don't have hau, can be given hau ora. In order for these things to again be circular, there is this idea of sustainability, pūmau. But again, it's a sustainability about that well-being. It's not just sustaining something to be sustained. A COVID-19 conclusion. Māori community responses to COVID-19, sorry, my fat fingers, evidence the principles of the circular economy with well-being at its core premised on principles of sustainability. In Māori responses to COVID, you will have seen the Māori community and each tribe ignite through its whakapapa, through its whanaungatanga, through its manakitanga, to look after ourselves. And it was only after the lockdown that we actually experienced a Māori death from COVID. So in what happened in that instance, I am asserting that principles of the circular economy guided Māori responses to COVID and also guide us in our responses to most all and any challenge. The biggest challenge, perhaps, in most of Māori society is tangihanga. Funerals, death ceremonies. And tangihanga at marae are the model, in my assertion, of best practice. When somebody dies, the Māori world immediately ignites. And you will see that people go to the marae. They know what they're doing. They have an immediate understanding because of their whakapapa and their interrelationships and that circularity in that world of how the well-being of the family, of the wider family, of the hapu, of the iwi is to be cared for. A microcosm of what we are asserting with Les as part of the macrocosm in the New Zealand economy. At lockdown, the tribal machinery is ignited. Tikanga was suspended. There's a willingness to be innovatory, to say, well, hold on, that won't help us at this time. We need to do something different, and perhaps that will transform how we behave in these kinds of spaces, in these kinds of issues. The support mechanisms jumped into place. So at our home, where my wife and I, both of us in our late 60s, and our daughter in her 30s, we received food packages, unasked for, which we then shared with our neighbours. Those were quite embarrassing because we didn't need them. We're not needy, but there were others in need who could not have survived without those supports being in place. Aroha, manakitanga, whanaungatanga, all of these words that most of you will probably be becoming familiar with, featured as a core element in this well-being and how to sustain that well-being in our circular economy. The tribal boundaries were reasserted. Te whānau Apanui closed off the boundaries. No COVID deaths in Te Whānau Apanui. Unfortunately, Hone, Harawira and Ngāpuhi were thwarted in the latest lockdown in terms of trying to close down Ngāpuhi. That was probably a big ask to make with everything that was happening in their world at that time. The whakapapa connections were revived. So in terms of transformational, I'm suggesting, we are suggesting, and here we are very dependent on Les and the other strands in our Mio Mio Aotearoa venture, adventure, that we can juxtapose mātauranga Māori and Western sciences. What we must be very careful of is that each retains its own ethic, that it's not marrying one to another so that one becomes a junior partner and suffers from the other, and therefore there's a divorce. It's about each retaining its own ethic, and in mātauranga Māori, an ethic is with whakapapa. And whakapapa joins the past to the present for the future. There are ways of measuring things. Tātauranga, tatauranga. So we measure with whakapapa, with laying down a tracking of what was and what is and what will be, and the importance of data within that, which is measured not only in terms of measuring 1 + 1, but also measured in how we approach that. Careful, deliberate, exact. The taiao, our environment, everything around us. Mai mua, mō muri. And from that mai mua, again a Māori concept that the past is actually in front of us. We see and know the past. We don't know our future, so the future is behind us. Not going to turn my back on you, but that's what I present to you this afternoon. Tēnā koutou. Kia ora hui i tātou katoa. Thank you. Please. I just lean up against it, my legs are too short.
Would you prefer this chair, Tom? Have this one.
No, that's fine. That's good.
We're very flexible.
Short legs.
You're okay. Well, thank you very much to our three presenters. We're not quite on time, so we're going to keep Q&A fairly brief, but they were wonderful presentations, so thank you very much for the insights that you've all provided. Any questions from the floor? Okay, I'll turn straight then to our online audience.
There's one over there.
Oh, I'm sorry, did I miss? I'm sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Liz.
Have we still got Donna online?
Donna, you're still there, aren't you? Yep.
Hi, Donna. I just had a question about the model that you put up for the project-based approach to the framework, I guess, for public policy going forward, and just wondering, is there real appetite for that in this current government? And if so, would that entail some sort of restructure of the current way that the ministries are working?
In terms of ministerial appetite, I can't definitively say. We have been having conversations around this new approach with some of our ministers, but absolutely, you know, just even like listening to what I was saying in terms of the challenges that it presents in terms of doing this sort of systemic policy. You can't do it in agencies in isolation. You've got to work across. But, you know, we are having to do that now. You know, we are working together with groups of agencies on different topics. So I think it's basically taking some of the collaborative approaches that we've been developing over time, and certainly through COVID, we've had to collaborate way more than what we would have otherwise. And so taking the learnings from that and the momentum from that, importantly, into some of our future policy, I think is a real a focus for me anyway.
Thank you. I also had another question. Is that okay? Yeah. Not for you, Donna, sorry. It was for Les, and your focus on reuse of waste and for the byproduct to actually become an input. And it looked like it was a very futuristic, or looking into the future project. Wondering if you guys get involved with any ideas about how to deal with byproduct waste that we currently have, like what we're sitting on in Matara, with the waste from the Tiwai smelter.
I think Tom will come in a moment, but I think in New Zealand terms, the sort of low-hanging fruit for the circular economy notion is in recycling. So ultimately, we would want innovation and endogenous growth and all those other things to be adding value over time. But you know, some of the big issues are, you know, tires, batteries, those sort of things. And I think we need some evidence from the scientists about how we best store all these all these old batteries that EVs will end up creating for us. When it comes to tires, again, I think we need some additional innovation from the science sector as to how we best deal with tires, and/or you build into the price of a tire when you buy it the recycling and removal of the tires at the end of their life. So much of the circular economy stuff is about end-of-life issues, as well as minimizing the amount of new raw materials that are in the production of it. So there's a life cycle to the product as well that's part of this. So in terms of government behavior, we sort of need maybe a set of standards such that you can't be a recycling depot unless you have certain facilities about leakage into the groundwater, that you've got an acceptable fire protection so we don't get, you know, mountains of tires burning up. So I think there would be some sort of licensing of that would be important.
Awesome, thanks so much, great work.
Thanks. We've got a question here.
If we've got a landfill site that's well constructed, that has no chance of leakage, they've spent an arm and a leg to make sure that it works really well, and they are charging tip fees that fully cover the cost of the landfill and make sure that it will be secure forever, it will not be leaching waste, and they've put in a fee for monitoring, they've got all that right, and it still costs less on complete cost recovery to put a tire in that landfill than to spend resource into putting it into something else. It sounds to me like you're advocating value destruction, and I want to know why you view that otherwise.
Well, I think the thing is that you mentioned effectively the cost of tires. So what you would need to do would be to put an end of life built into the price of those tires.
But it's built into the cost of tip fees.
I can't hear you, Eric.
Build into the cost of tip.
If you pay for it at the tip, then you've paid for it then. You don't have to pay for it up front.
So you're saying that I'm advocating value destruction?
If you are saying that we have to pay up front for some recycling scheme that by definition is going to be more expensive than putting something into a well-managed landfill, Like, I can completely take the case that we have to make really sure that the landfills work well and that we're running cost recovery. But if we've got all that set right and we've got the prices right there, I don't know why you think we need to have some other system set up around tires or anything else.
I think one of the issues about the circular economy is that there's an expectation, or there's an attempt to make sure that those byproducts have got higher value than they currently have in terms of a use value. And also, I mean, you've got societal problems about landfill. If you're saying, you know, how do we get rid of waste? We bury it. Then, you know, there certainly could be an economic case for that, because that's what we currently have. But we know that those landfill sites are never constructed in that way.
I'm going to leave this one for later discussion. I've got one last question that Tom, I'm going to address to you, please, if you could give us a response on it. And I've just done something. Oh, here's my question. In your project, you're working to quantify some values from the Maori world so that they have more weight in policy making. How do we do this?
I don't know. And that's why it's so exciting, is that what guides us to those kinds of answers. And I'm exploring what comes from my mātauranga Māori that shows how we value something, and how then do we measure that value. Too often, from my experience, I'm not an economist, so I don't want to teach grandma to suck eggs, but very often from my experience, something is valued through its monetizing. And I'm sure that there are other ways of showing how something can be valued, and therefore how we measure that value. I'm not sure how to do that just yet.
Well, we'll all be looking very much forward to updates on that. But thank you very much to Donna, to Les, and to Tom for your presentations. And let's give them a good round of applause for that.